Everyone, I'm Patty Dowd-Schmitz, and I'm a Laura Ingalls Wilder researcher and author who lives in Barrington, Illinois. I'm coming to you today on behalf of Barrington's White House, which was generous enough to allow me and my colleagues, Mary Pat Cleveland and Laura Keyes, to present a program about some little-known Laura Ingalls Wilder history. As most of you probably know, Laura Ingalls Wilder was the famous children's author who wrote a series of books commonly known as the Little House books. I'm actually coming to you right now from Elgin, Illinois, at the site of the Ingalls Pioneer Cemetery, where two of Laura's cousins are buried, but more on that in a moment. After I'm done talking, my friend Mary Pat and her partner Charlie will play some wonderful fiddle tunes from the pioneer times to entertain you. And my friend Laura Keyes, who is a character actress, will portray Laura Ingalls Wilder herself and show you some of the amazing clothing that the women would have worn during Laura and Charles' pioneer days. And she'll do a live demonstration of how those clothes would have been worn back in these times. Due to COVID, our program is pre-recorded, but afterwards, Laura, Mary Pat, and I will be live on Zoom if you'd like to ask us any questions. The Zoom link was sent to you in your confirmation email, and we'll let you know when to jump to the Zoom form after the presentation is finished so that you can talk with us. I hope you'll forgive me from reading a bit from my script. There are so many important things I want to tell you, and I don't want to leave any of them out. So I'm sure there are those of you in the audience who know a great deal about Laura Ingalls Wilder. There are probably some of you who know very little. So before we start, let me give you a little background in history. Laura Ingalls Wilder was born in Pepin, Wisconsin in 1867. She traveled with her family all over the Great Plains by covered wagon and lived in Independence, Kansas, Walnut Grove, Minnesota, Burr Oak, Iowa, and De Smet, South Dakota. After she was married, she moved with her husband Almanzo to Mansfield, Missouri, near Springfield. When she was in her 60s, she wrote her series of 9 little house books, which were a biographical chronology of her life from her toddler years in Wisconsin to her teenage years in South Dakota. From her novels, we have a wonderful picture of what pioneer life was like in America in the 1870s and 1880s. And it looked just like this, what you see behind me here, with the wind blowing and the beautiful prairie grass and fields. Because her writing was so descriptive and her stories so touching and biographical, her books have been beloved by generations of children and adults alike since she wrote them in the 1830s and 40s. Many of you also might remember the television show Little House on the Prairie from the 1970s. I grew up watching that show and adored it, but what I didn't realize then was that it was only loosely based on Laura's novels. As an adult, I became interested in the biographical elements of Laura's life. And like many of you Laura fans out there, I've visited almost all the real-life Laura Ingalls Wilder home sites and museums across the country. But what I also didn't know until I began digging deeper into Laura's real life was that her father, Charles, known as Pa in the books, actually grew up as a young boy and teenager just a few miles from where I live in Barrington, Illinois. In fact, Charles's boyhood was spent right here on this land on the prairies of Illinois in Plato and Campton Townships in Kane County, which is near Randall Road for those of you who are familiar with this area. As soon as I learned this tidbit of information over 12 years ago, I became obsessed with trying to dig up the genealogical details of young Charles's life in Kane County. Charles was born in Cuba, New York in 1836, and Laura biographies indicate that he was about 9 when he and his family came to Illinois. By researching old plat maps and genealogical records, I discovered that Charles's family were some of the very first pioneer settlers in Kane County. They came in about 1844 from New York via the Erie Canal by boat across the Great Lakes. They disembarked in Chicago and traveled by wagon to settle right here on this beautiful land with several Ingalls, aunts, uncles, and cousins who had all come several years earlier. Back then, it was common for families to migrate across the country in groups. In fact, the land that I'm standing on right now belonged to Charles's Uncle James. James's daughter, Eliza, is buried right here in this cemetery. She died at age 9 in 1850 of what they called brain inflammation back then. Her first cousin, Charles Ingalls, Pa, would likely have remembered her death at that time. The cemetery is Melvina Gutches, who was Eliza's contemporary-aged niece. She was the granddaughter of James Ingalls. Melvina and her sister Nancy, who is also presumed to be buried here, were struck by lightning in 1850 when they were 10 and 11 years old, just months after Eliza had died. Charles also likely remembered these traumatic deaths on the prairie. Charles's Uncle James had brought his entire family to the newly opened Prairie prairies of Illinois in 1838, likely traveling with his brother Samuel, who also brought his family at that time, and took a homestead just half a mile north of here. The Illinois prairies and Kane County had just been opened for settlement following the Black Hawk War of 1833, when the Potawatomi tribe who lived in this area was pushed west across the Mississippi River. James and Samuel and their families liked Kane County so much that they eventually encouraged their youngest brother, Lansford Ingalls, to bring his family as well. Lansford was Charles's father, and Laura Ingalls' was grandfather. She is better known as Grandpa in the Laura book, The Little House in the Big Woods. Lansford brought his young family to King County and likely lived on his Uncle James's land right here in Plato Township. According to the Ingalls family Bible, Charles's younger sister, Lydia LaDosha, otherwise known as Aunt Dosha in the Little House books, was born right here in 1845 when Plato Township was known as Washington Precinct, which is the location recorded in the Ingalls Bible for her birth. But Lansford and his family did not stay on his brother James's land for long. In 1848, the Ingalls family Bible shows that Charles's younger brother, Hiram Lemuel, was born in Fairfield Precinct, which was the early name for Hampton Township, just south of Plato Township, where it's standing. And in fact, Lansford and his family appear 2 years later on the 1850 Hampton Township census. Now I'm going to head just a mile south up Coron Road to Hampton Township, where I'll show you where Lansford lived with his family and where Charles spent his teenage years. But first, I'm going to make a quick stop down the road at the historic Coron Farm. So now here I am at Coron Farm, which was founded in 1835 by Robert Coron, who was a neighbor of the Ingalls. He lived just a mile south of the Ingalls land where we just were, where the cemetery was. In fact, some of Robert Coron's early record books that have been preserved by his family show that Robert sold potatoes in the 1840s. Thanks to the efforts of Robert's great-grandson Tom Coron and the Historic Coron Farm Preservation Society, this century farm in Kane County has been perfectly preserved as it was back in the day, and we can get a great glimpse into what prairie life would look like for the Ingalls time here by looking at this farm. The house behind me, not the frame house, but the brick house, was actually built in 1850, and likely the Ingalls would have watched it being built, as it was one of the grandest homes around at that time. If you come to visit this Laura site, you'll want to be sure to stop here at Coron Farm. So now I'm going to head just a couple miles west on Silver Glen Road to the site of the land where Lansford, Charles, and their family were listed on the 1850 census in Hampton Township. So now I'm actually at the corner of Silver Glen Road and Swanberg Road in Hampton Township. Behind me is the land that Charles would have grown up on when he was born. Lansford Ingalls never owned land in Kane County himself. Instead, he farmed the land that was likely to be shared with property, not the Township property. Because he never owned land, it was always difficult to determine exactly where he lived here in Kane County. I did a great deal of research, doing what I call tracing the route of the census taker and narrowing down the approximate location of where Lansford and his family would have been living in 1850. What I found was that their approximate location based on the census data coordinated precisely with land owned by Charles's first cousin and his Uncle James's daughter, Samantha Ingalls, who had married a man named John Collins. The Collins land is marked on many of the old maps from this time and is right behind me here. I'm standing on the very northern edge of the Collins land, and as you can see, it looks identical to how it would look in Charles' time, especially if they were farming corn at that time. Charles would have spent his years here as a young teenager, helping his father bring home the cows, wandering among the prairie grasses and the creeks, and learning how to hunt and trail. There's an old farmhouse and a large barn on the very southern end of this land on Empire Road, all the way down that way, about a mile. That house was owned by Samantha Ingalls Collins and her family until her death in 1903. I don't believe that Lansford and Charles and their family lived in that house, as I don't believe it was built until the 1850s, after the Ingalls had already moved to Concord, Wisconsin in 1851. Instead, according to their records, log cabin right around this area where the census taker found in 1850. I also believe that Charles was living in this area when he acquired his famous fiddle, which played such a big part in Laura's novel. case dates to 1850, exactly the same time that Charles lived here near Elgin. This is a town in the Fox River that had an early reputation for manufacturing and selling watches as well as musical instruments. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my presentation, even amid all the wind and the noise of the cars as they were going by, that this is very much how it would have looked back in Charles's time.